Hello, and welcome to the Citizens of Craft podcast, where we explore the objects we love, the reasons we love them, and the people who bring them to life. I'm your host, Megan Black. I want to welcome you to the Season 2 finale of the Citizens of Craft podcast. Now, I really can't believe I'm saying that already. The finale. It's been such a joy to bring together so many exciting guest speakers this season, uncovering truths and sharing stories about craft and the many ways that it touches our lives. But it's not over just yet, because this, at its core, is the root of our conversation today. The people behind the objects, the personal stories, and the purpose of why we make what we make. This whole series has been less about the how-to of craft and more about the why of craft. Why create? Why perfect? Why this form of art? Why does it matter? And why does what you make tell the story of who we are? Today's special guests are here to attempt to answer these very big and sometimes existential, but always interesting questions. Representing for Western Canada, we are very lucky to be joined by two mid-career craft artists, each with their own personal perspective to share. From Vancouver, British Columbia, we have glass artist and designer Benjamin Kikkert, who is also the president of the Glass Art Association of Canada and a recent competitor on the new Netflix glass-blowing reality series Blown Away, which, by the way, blew me away. If you haven't already seen it, then don't hesitate, because it is live craft in action. Hailing from Saskatchewan, we are also joined by the active craft blogger who has been writing for over a decade at musingaboutmud.com, a ceramic artist who explores all facets of life through her functional and sculptural pottery, from whimsical narratives to the outright political. Carole Epp. On today's episode, we cover a lot of ground, but all the elements of our conversation tie right back into our final Citizens of Craft manifesto statement: Vases are people too. Craft objects evoke their makers, letting you surround yourself with not just things, but with personalities. We start today's discussion with Carole Epp, reflecting on that very statement right now.
This one to me is a given, because it absolutely rings true. It's basically aligns itself with the mandate of why I make my work and how I believe an artist should present themselves within their work, which again is how I make work and not necessarily for everybody else. But I really feel like the more I bring in my own personality and my own vulnerabilities or my own perspectives into things, that the work becomes truer. So I look for that in other people's work all the time. I look for marks of the maker. I look for those little tidbits and cracks into who that person is behind that. And I was talking about all these pots that are littering shelves and stuff in my house, and I see all of those people within those pieces, and I'm very conscious of which pieces we collect, because it's those ones that really evoke that unique world perspective, even within that simple crafted objects, that are the ones that are most appealing to me.
So you essentially have a series of artists lining your shelves at home, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, and they're all people, places, and so many of them I've had the amazing pleasure of actually meeting, as a part of this job, right, and traveling and going to conferences and stuff like that. So sometimes I'll get a piece by an artist before I've actually met them, and it's always one of those things where it's like, oh, you actually are really like your pot when I meet them, right? And it's just like, oh, that's really nice. That's really reassuring, because I had this assumption about you. But I feel like we do that even with people with photographs, before we meet people. And I find that I do that with objects sometimes as well.
Interesting. And Benjamin, what were your thoughts when you first heard that vases are people too statement?
Well, I couldn't agree with Carole more. I think she's bang on. I really do look for, within my own work and other artists, I look to see the personality, and I'm really excited to see ideas presented there. It's funny how one conversation or one experience can stay with you and can inform you, and we're lucky enough to be fabricating objects that kind of articulate those observations and allow for a different dialogue, a tactile dialogue, if you will, with an idea. And I just can't say enough the number of times where, I've heard maybe an emerging artist or a student, wondering why they have to challenge this way, and why isn't it good enough to just make pretty objects. And I just think you can only go so far with a word like pretty. And how I describe viewing objects that are designed that way, or inspired by that, it just ends up to me coming across as a bit of a short sentence. And it's when someone is digging into those gritty little details, is trying to articulate some joy or excitement, some observation that really brings the viewer into their moment. And I think that's what people are really looking for. They want to share in the experience of the maker. And I reference, the longer I'm at it, the more I try to grasp that and bring that forward in my own work.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, and that's why people love going into studios and seeing inside studio spaces and seeing or meeting the artists like Carole mentioned. And I think that anyone who has even like tried to make something, whether it's like, a first stab at a knit hat or a pair of mittens, or trying your hand at the pottery wheel, even if they don't have the skills to do it, they do give a little bit of themselves to that project. So when you've made something, even if it's terrible when you start, when you've made something magical happens and you connect with that object. So once you do that, you really get a sense of that from other artworks that you're seeing and other pieces that you're seeing. That you put a little something of yourself into it. So now when you're a professional artist, on the other hand, this giving of yourself is amplified. I think you used that term earlier. I really like that. The giving of yourself is amplified because this is your chosen medium. So whether it's glass or ceramics, it's something that you've chosen to use to tell your story. So tell me a little bit about that. Like, what specifically are you choosing to tell through your work, through this medium that you've chosen? And I'm sure that there's a lot of things that you're trying to say, but maybe give me a recent example of something like that. And we'll start with Benjamin.
Well, interesting. Like I've given this a great deal of thought because, in a lot of ways, I really struggled to identify with a lot of contemporary glass because there's a lot of a craft tradition can be seen as being so established that statements like, "Oh, it's all been done before," or it's just technique. But I think that where I'm from I know it factors heavily into what I'm drawn into making, in that, and bear with me if anyone from Vancouver is listening here, that but Vancouver is a really small city, and Western Canada, for that matter, like population is really, really spread out. There's a lot of wide open spaces. So people in Vancouver, we love our city. It looks very pretty, but having spent some time in the rest of the world and been lucky enough to live in a few different places, I realized that culturally speaking, Vancouver and a lot of Western Canada is really quite young, is really small. And I find that where I am, the people around me, we tend to identify very strongly with landscape and the environment. And we kind of like substitute trees for culture, if you will. Whereas if I'm in New York City or Paris or something like that, you get into a situation where you can go to a musical every day. I just didn't realize that happened until I lived somewhere else, where I realized that there are these like thriving cultural communities that really had nothing to do with going to a park, every day after work. But that was just where I was from. So I bring that kind of landscape and environment into the artifacts I develop.
Your work really does have that gritty, tactile landscape connection. And even though it's glass, and even though it's, maybe the colors are different than what you would typically see, I like how on your website you display the work, with some reference to the types of landscape that you're inspired by. I think that it adds an interesting dimension.
I think, thank you very much. It's nice of you to say. I think that people really need to relate to the objects of a craftsperson. They need to. People don't have a tough time supporting that which they don't recognize or understand, and that doesn't mean that you have to replicate something. Far from it. But there needs to be a resonance. They have to relate to it, a harmony to their own experience. And if you succeed with that as a craftsperson, then kind of like the value of your own experience kind of comes out in your work, and people are excited to share that with you.
And now, Carole, that I think that message would ring true with your work as well, even though the aesthetic couldn't be more different between you and Benjamin. So tell me a little bit about what you were trying to capture. What message are you really trying to put through in your work?
Well, I mean, I think over the years, it's been interesting that as you sort of learn within your craft, I mean, I spent so much time focusing on the craftsmanship of the objects that I was making, and to the point where I was trying to bring in all these themes, but it was always about that object being so pure and so perfect in the end. And I think where I really started getting more excited about my work is when I let go of that and realized, okay, I have enough skill base here that I know what I'm doing. I don't know everything about it. There's flaws, there's this and that, but that I really let the subject matter flow through the pieces a lot more and sort of take center stage over the craftsmanship. So for me, it's like there isn't just a single message that I'm trying to get across in my work. I've always, both sculptural and functional work has always been fairly political. To me, it's always about social commentary. So I'm really trying to share the questions that I have. And my frustrations about the world. So, looking at humanity and what's happening in society, both at its beauty and then also contrasting that with the vile terror that humans can kind of inflict in the world. That's I'm trying to get all of that in and out through an object that somebody might even just use on the kitchen table day to day, which sort of seems like a lot to take on all at once. But I actually really love the idea that a craft object is so comfortable and so familiar that we can infuse it and sort of subvert it with these really more challenging narratives about political, social, environmental issues, but that people can come to it because it is a familiar object that they already have an understanding, that they don't feel separated from.
I think it's important to know, like, these objects, when they're functional, typically, they can be invisible in your life. They can be throwaway things. They can be something that you engage with every day, but you don't notice. But when you hold something that is a crafted object, or you're engaging with something that relates to your environment or relates to your experience, it awakens something in you that you wouldn't necessarily have engaged with. And you really, hit there, I think, Carole, with the idea that they're familiar enough, and maybe they're referencing the body enough in some way that it can open a door for someone to have a conversation they might not have typically had.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think that's just a fun thing to play around with because I hear all the time people who just want to turn off the TV and not deal with what's happening in the world and don't want to engage with political based art. So if you can come at them from a completely different, unexpected way, by the time they realize you're having that conversation, it's too late. They're already a part of it. And so that's kind of my sneaky goal with the work that I'm doing is that, and it's not even about the object in the end, which sounds sort of strange as a object maker, but to me, it's always more about that conversation and that subject matter. And so if in the end, the coffee mug brought you to having that conversation with me and this back and forth, that's great. But if the object falls away after and it's really about that conversation, then that to me is sort of the ideal.
So this really leads, I think it does. And this really leads into the idea of the reaction of the user. So when people do connect with things, what is that reaction, or what reaction are you trying to get? So with the idea of connection and self-expression and storytelling in mind, because we know these objects are imbued with those things, then we also understand kind of how and why the artists express themselves. You've both talked about why these topics are important to you, but how do the users or the consumers, the collectors, the viewers, how do they benefit from these experiences? And we'll start with Benjamin.
Well, I think Carole actually kind of touched on this when she's talking about, I love that, subverting the craft with these ideas. I think people are looking for something to hold on to as an idea, and you don't have to spell it out. I just think by thinking an object through and considering it, like I try to approach things like I use glass as my material, not as like my end goal. And so I try to create an object that where a viewer's like experience can develop and change over time. and whether they get everything that I put in at the beginning, or better yet, over time with a deeper relationship, they have a different understanding or better understanding. I find packing all that into the material, and then also like being open to sharing some of my own context as an artist, whether it's through like an image or explaining where a body of work came from. I just find it helps share the excitement and bring to light, some of the really like deep issues that we think about, and we may not be looking for them in the glass that's in our hand. But I found, recently I took part in an expedition to the Arctic called Canada
wow.
C3, and on that we explored a lot of different issues. Like I was there to study landscape, and there was this phenomenal archaeological like component, but I was working alongside scientists and children's writers, and talking to people of the Inuit community and Indigenous youth leaders, and like just a real broad spectrum, and the humanity of the experience, along with the rocks. It was so exciting to me that passion and that fire is like still coming out today. So I use I'm using the landscape as my vehicle maybe, but that additional experience kind of guides me, and I find that if I share a little bit of that, or even all of it with my audience, that very often those issues are in their minds as well.
So just taking a little bit of a different direction, unless there's a random experience that you've also been on a boat in the Arctic with a bunch of other people from different backgrounds and different experiences, Carole, maybe you can tell us about a particular experience where, something really hit a nerve for you through craft. I don't imagine it'll be the same story, but maybe you have the seed of the same story there.
When Ben was talking about like the passion of meeting all of these people up north and stuff, and even just that idea of passion really got me thinking about why it is that craft somehow allows us to create objects that are not so authoritative in their direct meaning, right? Like we as artists present certain things, we want certain things to be read through them, but through that process of how people engage with them over time, because it's not, a painting you see on the wall once at a museum. You have it in your home, you walk by it every day, you use it every day. Those narratives sort of change, but I think it made me think about how interesting craft is to me in the sense that that audience projects upon it. And I think there's something specific to craft there that allows audience in a different way. So I'm sort of going back to your other question.
No,
Sorry
that's
about
okay.
that. But that role of audience, I think crafted objects allow that. They allow that opening in where, and maybe it's in relation to the fact that people collect more sort of traditionally craft based things when they're on vacations and they're traveling, and it's sort of tied in with the tourist market as well. But we put our own readings onto those objects, and I think that opening in for audience is really important and fun to play with as well.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
put myself through college by selling like beads and pendants on the beach. I tried selling in lots of different places, and I found people are in really good moods on the beach. And I thought it was a good way to spend the day and hopefully make a bit of money. So anyways, I was trying to make like no two the same. I was just trying to kind of like improvise with every little piece, and just try to be kind of whimsical and play with color a lot. But like I would have a bowl of I don't know, a couple hundred beads there. But after listening to people, pick each one up and share their observation, I remember I had this one that was kind of like a teardrop, but it was a little crooked, and it was bright red, and everybody picked it up and said, it's a penguin. And and at no time was I ever referencing penguin when I made that, but I realized like I was in no place to dispute their experience. So they were right. It absolutely was a penguin, absolutely. And I may have been the maker, so I'm going to take responsibility. But yeah, you can't control the penguin. It just happens.
I love that.
And I love those reactions that you get, like whether they're good or bad, or whether they're expected or unexpected. You didn't intend for the penguin to come out, but there it was, plain as day, that everyone saw. So, Carole, you mentioned people applying themselves or applying their own impressions to your work. So why do you think maybe that craft in particular is a good way for people to collect those stories, or maybe even act as a reflection of their own stories?
Well, maybe it's just the fact that as craftspeople, I mean, we rely on different communities of people to help with the objects that we're making, right? We've got communal studios, we do firings together. There's something about the ego of the individual artist that's maybe worn down a little bit within the crafts field, that allows it so that it isn't that one-way projection of what it is that the work is about. And so I find craftspeople are very much they allow those other readings to come back at them, and let it be the penguin, let it be whatever it needs to be. I've had a lot of really amazing experiences with particularly the dishware that I make, where people really do see themselves in it. And those little successes of hearing a story from somebody, of what it is that is in that object for them, that to me is like the ultimate success that I could ever have as an artist. I had one woman at one point, I had a sale of a bunch of different work. It was sort of a crossover between the stuff I'd been making at grad school and the beginnings of the more sort of childlike illustrative work that I was doing. And an older woman came, and she was purchasing a piece for Christmas for her brother. And it was like an espresso cup, sort of, for whiskey, whatever type of thing. And she was drawn to the older work that I'd made in grad school that was a lot more about the form and really pristine porcelain base. But then she kept picking up this other cup, which was a small little tumbler, and it was a lot more sort of organic and roughed edged, and it had little stampings of orange letters on this cup. And she was back and forth, and I talked to her, and she wouldn't sort of let me in. And finally she decided, okay, this other cup is the one for her brother. And I said, that's fine. But I said, I'm not letting you leave until you tell me what's in this other cup. Right, this one with the little orange letters. And so she started telling me about how her mother had just passed away, and her brother were actually in town, going through her mother's attic and going through all of the stuff and deciding what to keep and deciding what to give away. And that she had found this dress that she had always remembered from when she was a child and didn't realize her mother had kept it. And that it was a dress that had an embroidered yoke on the top of the dress around the neckline. And it had the alphabet letters embroidered in orange, same as this cup. And it was one of those moments where two worlds absolutely collided. And I could see in her this whole history and what she was going through, and the emotions of losing her mother and being with her brother during this time, and going back to her childhood and stuff. And that one single cup established all of that narrative for her. And to me, that blew me out of the water. Like, that's exactly why I make things. If I can sum it up into one story.
Deep. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's spectacular. That's great.
Yeah. I was like, you're taking the cup home. Nobody else gets this cup. You don't have to pay for it. It's yours. We cried in the booth at the Christmas sale. Yeah, it was absolutely like it gave you chills, because it was that proof to me that an object could be that meaningful to somebody else. And it's not going to hit on it if that never happens to me again in life, that's fine. If I was able to achieve that once, that's that absolute power of an object, a crafted object.
You've been listening to Citizens of Craft, the podcast, with Benjamin Kikkert and Carole Epp. For today's special segment, The Topic at Hand, we're going to do a little bit of time traveling to this past spring, when I had the opportunity to meet with Joan Bruno, a professional studio potter and sole proprietor of Nova Terracotta Pottery in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. Thanks to our partners at Craft Nova Scotia, we met up for a chat at the Mary E. Black Gallery in the Nova Scotia Centre for Craft and Design, where we discussed Joan's career, the public's growing interest in ceramics, and how companies like Tucker's Pottery help hobbyists and professionals alike to pursue their passion. You know, you're doing your work at really an international level, but you're living in a very small town in a space like Lunenburg and creating that really interesting space, creating space for activity to happen. What was it about Lunenburg or what is it about Lunenburg that keeps you going and growing from a space like that?
Well, the reason I ended up in Lunenburg is because when I moved there, it was 1994, and I couldn't afford anything else anywhere else. And the South Shore of Nova Scotia has 3 towns that are very close to each other. Each town has a distinctive character. There's Chester, Mahone Bay, and Lunenburg. And Lunenburg was a fishing town 25 years ago, and the fisheries, of course, died. And so properties were super cheap, and I bought my building for like $20,000.
Oh, wow.
And that's why I ended up in Lunenburg. It's all I could afford, and I had a very low overhead, and that's how I could survive. And I lived above my shop for all of those years.
Wow.
And I've taught part-time at NSCAD in ceramics for all of these years, and that kind of kept me connected to the greater ceramics community. It also has been stimulating my work for all of those years, and it also just provided subsistence income over the winter because it's a seasonal business.
Yeah. So things have certainly changed over the last 30 years, and just in the world. So how has your experience working from a place like Lunenburg, or just in general, changed over the course of that time?
Oh, well, Lunenburg, it's really interesting because, you know, when I first moved to Lunenburg, I thought, oh my God, what have I done? You know, there's nobody my age. People are only moving here to retire. And, you know, it's very seasonal. But it's been really exciting to see the changes in town and over the years. And there's the Lunenburg School of the Arts now. There's also, the Lunenburg Academy of Performance, Music Performance, which has wonderful music residency programs. So they're classical music concerts that you otherwise would never see east of Montreal. You know, it's fabulous. So the town has really grown up, but yet it still has it's still a small town.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that really changed Lunenburg was in 1995, it was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The mayor was really smart to do that. And that's when things started to change.
Wow.
Otherwise, people would still be putting vinyl sidings on the houses. You know, there might be a Walmart.
Yeah. So that designation allowed people to really have faith in, and I guess town council and whatnot make some rules around what this is going to stay as and what it's going to look like, but be able to have contemporary activity going on, but still have that sort of UNESCO World Heritage charm going on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah. So I lucked out because I bought my building the year before it changed.
Oh, wow.
So the property values started to go up as soon as you know, because people, you know, one thing about Lunenburg, it attracts, because of the architecture, it attracts people who love beauty, which is really nice because there are more people moving to Lunenburg now who are my kind of people.
Okay.
And so there are people who are attracted to beauty and craftsmanship and all of those things we value about crafts.
Yeah.
So, you know, my building, for instance, is a classic Lunenburg house, and it's like a really nice pot. It's beautifully designed. It has elements of ornament on it, and it functions really well.
Yeah, it certainly catches your eye from the street when you're going down the road there.
Yeah, and that's just a typical house in Lunenburg.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, you know, they say like, oh, home is where the heart is, but in craft, we often have to reach out of our home communities, or we're lucky to be able to reach out of our home communities and have work or shows that travel, and you get to travel yourself because you do a lot of teaching, you know, you mentioned at NSCAD, but also around the world. So recently, you did a workshop with Tucker Pottery in Ontario.
Yes.
And what was that experience like? What is it like to do those kinds of things outside of your home region?
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I love it because you're parachuted into a community where people are, you know, we all love pots and we all have similar interests. And I find with workshops, I feel like I learn more from the audience than they might learn from me because everyone has tips and tricks. And Tucker's is wonderful because they've always been huge supporters of ceramic artists. And they, you know, just offering workshops is a wonderful offering to the community. And they had a really good turnout, and Frank Tucker's wonderful. And they're just so supportive, and they always are bringing in wonderful tools, and I'm a total tool junkie. So we don't have a supplier in Nova Scotia anymore in the Maritimes.
Really?
So to get to go into a shop where they have all of the new, latest, greatest tools and brushes and stuff is like being a kid in a candy shop.
It's like Christmas morning, right?
Yes.
And Tucker supplies people who are doing craft as a personal endeavor. It also supplies people like yourself who are doing it professionally. When you're in a place like that or an experience like that, you get to see all those different levels of ceramic activity happening, right? So have you seen a change in who is coming to those places or who is coming to ceramics in general?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. Like there are a lot of baby boomers who maybe went to art school in the 70s and now they're retired or taking early retirements and taking ceramics classes. And I really notice that in my shop. I have so many people, retired people coming in and saying, I'm a potter. And then I realized they're not really potters. They just take a class at a community center, but they're really passionate about it. So there are a lot more hobby potters who are retired. But there's also this, what's exciting also is that there's a wave of young potters coming up the pike, and Carole Epp and Mariko Patterson have done amazing work at promoting Canadian ceramics, but especially young emerging artists who otherwise, it's very difficult to get any kind of recognition in the U.S. and that's where it's happening. There's so many opportunities in the U.S. simply because there are a lot more schools and a lot more programs and more people, more
bigger population. Absolutely.
Yeah. So thanks to Carole Epp and Mariko, there's a lot more exposure. So in their exposure, I've discovered a lot of potters across Canada that I would otherwise not have known about.
Wow, yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, I love the work that they both do, and like bringing their own unique style to things and changing it up, and really adding to this whole ceramic milieu.
Yeah, it's fantastic. They're doing great work with make and do, and
And so, why do you think that people are attracted to it? Whether they're doing it as a hobby, whether they're doing it professionally, why clay?
Good question. Well, it's incredibly seductive. It's just a really seductive material. People either love it or hate it, and I think everybody has an affinity with a different type of material and process. So I think ceramics is really, for one thing, it's more and more accessible because there are more residency programs. That's one thing, so people can study. And then when I was a student, there were no options. There were options, but there are just a lot more options now for residencies. And my generation would go to get your undergrad degree, and then we were encouraged to get a graduate degree right away. And that was where you would really develop your work. And that's why I went to graduate school, to develop my work. Teaching wasn't really something I was interested in that much.
Oh, really?
It was more about developing my work, and I just never felt, the confidence I have now is because I'm 55 and I've earned it. I was never naturally confident, and so I felt like, I just need, my work is just not developed enough to put it out there. So I went, I worked on my education. But I think there's so many options now for graduate school that I think a lot of younger people are just going and doing residencies. So I think that's been a help. I think also there are more community centers, and people are also learning online. Even students, the students I've had at NESCAT, if they want a tutorial, they'll just go on YouTube and learn a skill.
Yeah, you can watch people on, those live streaming channels like Twitch making ceramics.
Exactly.
And just there, and it's like you're hanging out in their studio with them.
Yeah, so a lot of people are learning that way, and that's kind of an eye-opener to me, because I'm so old school, hands-on, but yeah, I think that's part of it as well.
But I think that old school hands-on thing is a part of the attraction to it too. We live in this world that's like everybody just swipes. We're constantly in
live on a screen.
This digital connection, but we're not necessarily having a tactile connection. So I'm not dissing the digital world. There's so many exciting things that are happening there too, but there's something really real and exciting about getting your hands into a material when maybe you've never done that before, or maybe you just haven't had that in your life before. And it kind of opens up this whole other world, and you see the world differently when you understand how things are made. So I think that's part of the attraction of people coming back to play as well.
I absolutely agree. And I've had a shop for 25 years, and I deal with the public directly, so I've seen the waves. And in the 90s, craft really had an apex, and people were people were buying a lot of craft objects. And then there was a bit of a lull in the early 2000s when the iPhone became popular. And I think people were just so enamored with technology and the magic of the iPhone. And now I think that people are appreciating the magic of the handmade as long as they're educated about the skill it takes to make something. Manual skill and dexterity and ideas manifested in objects. And yeah, there's definitely, it's nice to see younger people coming into my shop now and buying things.
Nice.
It's good. And younger people making things for all of those reasons. I think, there is a renaissance happening now.
And now, back to our main interview with ceramic artist Carole Epp and glass artist Benjamin Kikkert.
I can take half a step back here and kind of come in on the other side of the story Carole just told. I can remember very recently, actually, I had a client I was dealing with who, it was a commission, and the only real information that I had going forward were, there was probably 60 pictures of contemporary glass, which I didn't really get too much out of because we saw something else. And then a photograph of a bright green Italian sports car. And I was supposed to make something from that. And I went back to the client and I said, I'm really having a tough time holding on to this. Like, you don't want me to make a sports car, do you? And no, absolutely not. It's the color. And it was a beautiful color, like an electric mint green kind of thing. But listening to Carole's story, the color orange is what came through, but I needed more. I needed something to hold on to. I needed that backstory of what is the orange? And it was, as I dug into that, I went back, and to be honest, I think the client was getting kind of annoyed with me because they just wanted me to make it, right? They were a professional, someone in the position to commission me to do this work is kind of used to getting what they want done, right? They've already shown me a lot of faith in bringing me on. So anyways, we had this hilarious back and forth, and it was probably the third or fourth conversation we had where I was just peppering, I was like, what do you like to do in your spare time? And it's kitchen design, and so kitchens are clean and sleek, but I just wasn't doing it. And then I thought, where was the last place? You said you like to travel? Yes. Where was your last great vacation? Denmark. Okay, I got excited on that, right? Because Denmark's got a fabulous design tradition. And what was the thing that you liked about Denmark? The people. The food. The architecture. And that was all I needed. I took that color and I just studied architecture for a little bit. And then I right away, I had a feeling for what they wanted to articulate in that piece. And so that way, the freedom for the craftsperson was great, but I needed something to work around, to hold on to. And then everything went really well after that. But I sure learned a lesson there that don't show me a picture of a sports car, okay? I don't know what to do.
Well, I mean, that kind of leads into the final kind of section of what I want to talk about a little bit today. And that idea of bear with me here, the themes of mass production and mass consumption, because you're talking about the exact opposite of that, of having something custom made specifically for you to reflect some component of, how you see the world. So we've actually talked a lot about this in this season of the podcast about mass production, about mass consumption, and how we're kind of surrounded by these nameless, faceless objects. And we've talked about that a little bit today already. But how do you see, or do you see, a resurgence of interest in craft in your community? Do you see people turning away from that mass consumption or that mass production? And why should they? So how do you see that in your own community? What does it look like? And we'll start with Carole.
Well, specifically within this Saskatchewan, in the province, in the last 6 months, we've had 2 ceramic studios open, one in Regina and one in Saskatoon. And I think what I really am noticing is that it's not even so much that people are buying more craft-based work. And I've been involved over the years in an organization where we started a different sort of model for craft sales here in Saskatoon, and sort of started presenting craft differently. And we really saw that there was a huge audience for that wanted to sort of be sold to and marketed to in a very different way. But what I'm seeing now is that people just want to get beyond just the purchasing of it, and they want to understand it by making it. And so we've got specific clay programs that are opening up. We've got like a craft school here in Saskatoon that's opened up. There's far more workshops. Printmaking studios are opening their doors to teach a lot more. And there's just an audience that's really thirsty and hungry for that. And I find that, I mean, maybe I'm making a jump with this, but I look at social media a lot too in terms of how people market their work and how as artists we can build our business. And I think people now, we used to always just sort of sell the finished object to people. You would see it in a catalog or you would see it in the art gallery. It was always shot against this perfect black backdrop that wasn't distracting or anything. And you go on Instagram, for example, now, and what we're showing our audiences is all these stages of the process, where we're exposing the techniques, we're allowing people to see that, oh, we started this sculpture and it's actually 3 months later that it's getting finished. And so there's this sort of temporal sort of experience for people too. And I think that even selling work, I've noticed that people have a different understanding of it, but that people are really interested in that now. And social media has really sort of changed our language of how we're educating our audiences about craft. And I think it's a really beautiful, powerful thing.
Wow. And Benjamin, you have a studio in, basically on the street, direct access for people to be able to come in and look and see the finished project, but also see the work in progress sometimes. So, has that been your experience as well?
Hey, what are you making? I hear a lot of that. What are you making? Or when are you going to be working? Oh, and you know what? But I don't want to sound too cheeky when I say that, because I do remind people, although unfortunately I'm not holding up big balloons of glass all day long, just puffing and puffing and puffing. But if people didn't take an interest in what we're doing, we'd be dead in the water, right? So being open to the public is a real strain. And sometimes I run into a little problem where I have to explain that actually talking about my work is not actually making my work. And sometimes I have to kind of separate the two. But I do find that the more I'm able to present, like I try to share with my business, I try to share an experience. I want someone when they walk in the door, not to think that they're walking into a gallery, although they are. We sell work here, but they walk into the experience of a functioning studio. So we pack our work in the middle of the room. We photograph it upstairs. We grind it in the back, and we're not shy about sharing that with our customers. And it's funny because people will walk. You can't control what walks in the door, and one person might not appreciate that experience. They might be expecting, like not consciously, but subconsciously, they might be expecting something a little bit more like a department store. Like they're going to walk in, they're going to find a souvenir, and they're going to purchase it. But in the broader picture, I think I had a woman in not long ago, and she had seen a lot of glass, and when she turned to me and she said, a lot of this I could have been made anywhere. And I said, yeah, there's certain things, like ornaments and little bowls and stuff like that. But when she said, but a lot of this work, I have never seen anything like it before. And that's ultimately, what I'm trying to do is to bring someone something that engages them and brings them into my process and makes them challenge what, better yet, why do you like this and why do you like that? It's that kind of information and education, I just think it's just better for everyone. It's better for me, better for the client, and better for the community as a whole.
Absolutely. And just to get the idea across there that these objects don't just appear out of nowhere. They're born of ideas. They're born of moments. They're like literally crafted in the studio by people's hands. And it's an amazing process that not everyone gets the lucky chance to see behind the scenes. So now that we have these opportunities to allow people into that moment, I think it's a really important process as part of the thing of what we do as craftspeople.
But I think we're also exposing a lot of that. You open yourself up. I mean, my studio is in my basement. Nobody sees me when I, have to throw a pot out type of thing. But exposing that even online through social media, or Benjamin, like how people can walk in when you're right in the middle of a failure. I think there's not that you fail very often. I'm sure you don't.
Oh, every day.
But I think there's something about that that's such an important part of that education process too, because craftspeople can be overly romanticized, right? And it's just, there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that goes into that work, which is why we need to push the price point on it. We need to fight for it to be valued in the right ways. And the more we expose that side of things as well, and take away some of that mystery of how it's done, let them see that process and let them see exactly how hard it is and how often it does fail. I think that there's something really valuable in that as well, even though it's sort of gut-wrenching to fail in front of a group of people. But we've all been there, done that on a daily basis.
The best of us. And I wasn't going to ask this question, but someone mentioned it to me, or I think it was mentioned online. Someone suggested that we ask the speakers on the podcast what was what was a big failure, but something that you learned from. So maybe if you're willing to share that, I know there's at least one person out there who's interested in that question. Benjamin, it seems like you've got something on your mind immediately.
Well, every situation, I always come out of it just trying to figure out how I could do it better, whether it's a piece or a conversation. Or I'm relentless. Like, the dedication is around the clock. So I'm always thinking about developing work and what I'm doing. But honestly, you alluded to it in your introduction. So recently, I took part in a competitive glassblowing reality show, and that was that's why I was laughing, because that was show business, and even though I walked into that thinking about my practice and what's behind my work and all that, that job, what I was doing was really separate from my professional practice.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was a project that I worked on. And why I laugh so much is that it's funny in like, it doesn't bother me at all. Like, and I love it that people get excited about it. But I find it really interesting that even friends and family, they see how you're portrayed in something like that, or any success or failure on a stage like that. They're worried about my feelings. But it's funny, as a practicing exhibiting professional, like, I do shows all the time, and I have little successes and failures in my studio by myself all the time. And if I lose a piece, I have to get over it. And if an exhibition doesn't go super well, I move on, because ultimately I'm so excited to get into the studio tomorrow and bring everything that I've learned into it, that's what's driving me forward anyway. So I try not to get hung up on things. I just try to do it better next time.
That's a very good approach to take, for sure. Carole, do you have anything to share when it comes to the failures and the things you've learned from them?
Oh, yes. So this is a hard one, actually, for me to talk about. But this was a failure that I had in the last couple of years that really sort of shook me and made me reevaluate what I was doing completely. So when I first, I tout that my work is political and that I'm trying to be socially minded with everything that I'm doing. And when I first started making these children's dishes, it was very much about this idea of getting handmade objects into children's hands and starting that education early, and being counter to disposability and, sort of over waste and plastics and all that kind of stuff. So I started drawing images of people on the pots as well, and I'm known for drawing cats and birds and all that fun, lovely stuff. And I had been working on this series for probably a couple years, and I had this moment of realization of how ignorant that I was, that I had actually never colored in any skin tone in any of my characters. And I'd been going forward with this notion that, I was just leaving it blank so that anybody could project themselves onto it. And it was this moment of failure where I realized how ignorant and privileged and white I was. And it really made me sort of stop and go, okay, I need to step back from all of my work and really think about what blinders I have on, and what, I'm saying I'm doing these things, but am I actually really thinking about it properly? Am I messing up that much and that badly without really realizing it? And so that was probably my biggest failure, and I learned a lot from it. And a lot of my work now, in terms of the sculptural work, and even in the last 6 months, and going forward, I'm developing a series of more political pots that sort of bridge the two theme, like more of the sculptural work themes into the other. And I'm really focusing it on coming from that point of privilege and whiteness, and exposing that, and exposing my failures, because I can't speak for other minorities, nor do I want to, but I want to engage these subject matters that do impact people throughout the world. But I have to always come at it from the position that I'm in. But that was just really one of those moments where I realized, like, I really fucked up. Um, so I have to use that word because it was such a big failure, because my privilege just did not allow me to see that I needed to give people skin tone. I needed to have same sex couples. I needed to represent all these different things and be very, very conscious about doing that if I wanted this work to be as inclusive as I was claiming it should be. So yeah, so it's very embarrassing for me to talk about it, because it wasn't just a failure in terms of the artwork. It was a failure in terms of me as a human being.
But I think the
There
most
you go.
important part about all of these failures, whether they're, accidents in the studio, or whether they're like introspective reviews about what the content of your own work has been or could be or should be, it's that openness to recognizing that failure and continuing to build on it and continuing to work towards something better and continuing to have conversations about why those things matter and how they can change for the future. We're all starting from somewhere, and craft is a mode for us to have those realizations and those recognitions, because it's a way that we engage with society. So I really think it's an amazing tool for us to all develop and change for the better, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's one of those things that's sort of an embarrassment, but at the same time, I know how much it's allowed me to grow, and I know that by sharing that story, even in the hope that other people can reevaluate and go, oh, maybe how am I looking at these things, and maybe that might shed light on something else. I'm all for being called out, because I think that's how we grow and that's how we learn. So if in the future that sort of similar situation happens, I'm all for reevaluating and going back into
Amazing.
it. Yeah.
If I can just chime in on something here, because I really agree with this process. Like that's kind of how we started talking about achieving a kind of depth with your work. I think this like process of self-examination is vital to understanding. And like one day I woke up and I was a middle-aged European male. And I was like, good golly, like people like me have been doing some pretty terrible things historically. And I realized that, I had to go past this. But if I may say that I think, reality show aside, I do think that our culture is kind of hung up on this idea of talent. Like one day I'm going to decide to jump, and what do you know? I can jump higher and farther than anybody else in the world. That's actually a really exciting idea, and that's what like kind of reality TV does. But I find that in my practice, like I can teach somebody to blow glass, but talent doesn't get you this like self-examination and the wisdom that we're talking about, and it does take a lot of experience, and you do have to really focus and bear down to get that content into your work. People will ask us, do you know what you're making before you start? And of course we do. It's not luck that we come up with anything, but I realize that you have to take a moment to explain, and how I do explain it is even though I can choose any direction in anything that I do, intellectually or like mentally, it feels a lot like performing a piece of music where I can change the inflection and the emphasis, but if I change the notes too much, I'll be playing a completely different song. And so I have the flexibility of playing any style and any genre I want. But ultimately, when I sit down at the bench of a million decisions. I have to have a very clear idea as to what I'm trying to accomplish in that moment. And then the object that I create will forever reflect that thought process from that moment.
And again, can reflect what people are feeling in that moment when they receive it. Wow.
Yeah.
So I was also going to ask this
Hopefully.
big question about like what's the importance of craft in society for the future, but I feel like you guys have already kind of answered that question through the processes of this whole conversation. But is there anything else that you want to add? Anything else that you think is important to say about the value of craft or the impact of craft, maybe on whether it's on you or on society or on, you know, the greater good of the world? Any other final thoughts about the impact of craft?
I guess I feel like craft has always been that recorder of cultural history, right? And so that's really, it's been a beautiful way of how we've gotten to learn about different cultures. So I feel like craft will always, and art for that matter, not to separate the two, will always be that beautiful recording of who we are as humanity. And so it's always relevant for that sake. Media gets twisted, it comes and goes, the focus of it and everything. But so long as we try and look at as many narratives as possible in terms of how cultures are growing and what they're engaging with, and we can see that through their art and craft, I think it's that beautiful way of recording humanity that's always going to be relevant.
Absolutely. I think that the like a true sign of like a strong and vibrant culture can be found in the craft of that culture, and these are actually really, really vivid presentations of what life's like, and I think we lose that today when we focus on consumerism and you know price point and you know fast fashion and things like that. They throw things off, and like Carole was mentioning earlier about the value of social media has actually really, I feel, really presented an opportunity to empower the craftsperson to connect with a broader base and not so much compete, but provide something different than the mass-produced and become accessible. So, you know, you can be in a studio that's not visible to the public at all, but you can still connect to people who love your work, because very often people are looking for it. They just don't know where to look. They might not even know what it's called, you know? I remember not long ago, I remember telling somebody that they were actually interested in fine craft because they kept using the word art. And I said, like, no, you're looking for fine craft, and I'm not correcting you, but I'm hoping this will help you narrow your search. Well, that was a little bit of unsolicited advice, so I'm not sure how well it went over. But at the end of the day, I really do think, like Carole says, like the strength of a culture can be measured through these objects. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that supporting those people in your community and the objects they're making, it actually helps generate a shared experience and helps us enjoy our common culture.
And this brings us to the end, my friends. Season 2 is officially a wrap. It's been a real pleasure putting together these special episodes, and I want to thank everyone for their contributions to the project. Now, bear with me, there's quite a few people to thank. First, thank you to Carole Epp, Benjamin Kikkert, and Joan Bruno for joining us in the finale. I hope their energy and passion seeps through the digital airwaves and into your own studio practices and collections, because you are a part of this whole continuum of craft. It is because of the strength of this community that craft continues to flourish. Also helping craft to flourish are the folks who helped connect us to the very materials we work with. We would like to thank one of those suppliers, and this episode's generous sponsor, Tucker's Pottery. Since 1975, Tucker's has provided the highest quality ceramic equipment and supplies for professional, hobbyist, and student potters alike. And if you're anything like me, you might have had your very first taste of professional craft through the world of ceramics. Once you've touched clay, you can never forget the primal feeling of sinking your fingers into the cool, damp material and realizing just how many directions you could take that lump of clay. It is one of the purest feelings of potential. Anywhere a clay studio resides, that potential resides, and beauty inevitably follows, along with a few boxes of Tucker's Pottery clay, which are bound to be found on the studio shelves as well. Trying your hand at ceramics, or any of the material arts, can lead you into professional studios, down into the basements and back halls of art galleries, through the maze of community art centers, into university classrooms, and towards some of the most exciting museum collections around the globe. Craft moves us, and I know it moves the team at Tucker's as well. So thank you very much to their staff for their support of this podcast. Check out tuckerspotteryeshop.com today. I want to thank our incredible digital content developer, Vina Carr, who helped us shape the feel of every episode and who poured her heart into this project. The podcast would not have happened without her. Thank you to the CCF promotions team and the Citizens of Craft Committee, who brought great ideas and great advice forward. And thank you to Stephen Hurley, our producer at Vases Radio, who deserves so much credit for helping this project make it to the digital airwaves. Thank you, Stephen, for all your guidance and hard work. Thank you also to our sponsors and funders who really made this season possible, including the Canada Council for the Arts, Vases Radio, Studio Magazine, the New Brunswick College of Craft and Design, Crafted Vancouver, the Sheila Hugh Mackay Foundation, and Tucker's Pottery. I'd like to say thank you and recognize the dedicated efforts of our many colleagues at the provincial and territorial craft councils, as well as the Canadian Crafts Federation's many affiliate members. This includes the Canadian Clay and Glass Gallery, the Lunenburg School of the Arts, Northwest Territories Arts, Craft Alliance Atlantic, the Cape Breton Centre for Craft and Design, the New Brunswick College of Craft and Design, Crafted Vancouver, myceo.ca, the Alberta University of the Arts, the St. John Art Centre, the Maison des Métiers d'Art du Québec, et le Musée des Maîtres et Artisans du Québec. Our members make this network an exciting, interesting, and thriving community. So if you represent a craft-based school, gallery, or national guild or institution, consider joining this national craft network and build your connections in the professional field of Canadian fine craft today. Now, last but certainly not least, we cannot forget to thank you, our listeners. Thank you for joining us on this journey through contemporary craft. We made this podcast for you, to help craft speak for itself and for craft to be heard. If you loved the podcast, then please shout it out. Help us reach even more listeners like you. Connect with us online on Facebook and Instagram, or send us an email at info@canadiancraftsfederation.ca to share your feedback, request more episodes, and to find out how you can donate to the Canadian Crafts Federation's future projects today. And remember that craft is about more than the objects. It's about the people, the community, and the way it binds us all together, because vases are people too. So thank you for listening, and until next time, craft on.